All right, beautiful people, let's jump back into it. We are walking it out, taking a journey through the Bible, starting with Genesis, making our way through to Revelation, with the goal of understanding, like, what is God's story? What is the big picture? What is the overarching narrative, right? And then how do I find my story in that story? How do I take the principles and the lessons that are being taught and apply them to my journey with God today? And so right now we're on Genesis chapter 7. Just for a quick recap, Adam and Eve, they're saying, let me back up a little bit. If you need to catch up with where we are right now, that's fine. There's a whole playlist, Genesis 1 through 6. You can go watch those videos or just read those chapters and then jump back into this video so that you understand the context. So Adam and Eve's sin has influenced generation after generation and has had detrimental effects. God is upset with the evil in the world. Generations later, there's so much evil in the world. Last week we talked about how there was just so much sin and everyone was doing what their own hearts desired, and just that God talked about how the human heart was inclined towards evil and sin, and just God's heart was broken and he was dissatisfied, and so he wanted to just wipe out the entire human race. He was so, just all living things, he was just so dissatisfied with how things were unfolding, and but God decided not to because of one man. Because he found righteousness in one man. There was one man who walked closely with the Lord, and God found favor with him because of his walk with his relationship with God. And that man was the man Noah. So what God said he was going to do was he was going to preserve Noah's life and his family's life, and he was going to wipe out the rest of the world. He was going to start over through Noah's lineage. And so we get to chapter 7, and back in chapter 6, God had given Noah detailed instructions to build this ark. He told Noah, listen, there's going to be a flood for 40 days, and this flood is going to wipe out all of humanity. So what I want you to do is I want you to build an ark. Not just humanity, but all living things, the animals, everything, the plants, everything living. So he said, no, I want you to build an ark. I want you to build a boat. And God gave him instructions on exactly how he wanted him to build a boat and what he wanted Noah to take inside the boat. All the different animals, all the different creatures, because God, from the life that God preserved on that boat, that ark, is how God was going to start over after he wiped out every human being on the face of the earth. So he gives Noah detailed instructions on building the boat and putting on the various animals in the boat. And the line that really stood out to me in chapter 6 was, and Noah did as God instructed. I left us with the question last week, can that be the conclusion of our lives? Liana, my name, can that be the conclusion of your life? Can it be said of my life, Liana did as God instructed? Because we realized that what Noah did, Noah's obedience to God influenced God's plan. It influenced generations. It influenced the state of humanity. And I just asked me, like, how seriously do I take God's instructions in my life? Do I realize that when God gives me instructions, it has implications to bless or implications to destroy based on how I respond to God? And I want my life to be able to say, Liana did as God instructed. And I already know, no, I have not done that perfectly. But as I move forward, am I obeying God? Are you obeying God? As Noah's obeyed God, it influenced so much. So let's jump into the questions for this week. The first question was, at what point did God tell Noah to go into the ark? And for clarification, I'm using the New Living Translation of the Bible. So when you're answering these questions, know that my questions are coming based on the wording of the New Living Translation. So if you want to follow along a little bit easier, maybe you should use that version of the Bible. Because it says, the first question, at what point did God tell Noah to go into the boat? The answer based on verse 1 is when everything was ready. And I just wanted to pinpoint that, like, God moves in our lives when he is ready based on what he has ordered to occur in our lives, and we don't always know what that is. Number 2, how did God describe Noah versus all the people on the earth? God described Noah as being righteous. Number 3, how many pairs of animals approved for eating a sacrifice was Noah to take on the ark? The answer is 7 pairs. Number 4, why did there need to be a male and a female of each animal? Verse 3, to ensure that all life will survive on the earth after the flood. Because remember, God's starting over. Well, he has to start over for something. So God is telling Noah to put these animals on the boat in male and female pairs so that they can reproduce once the flood is over. How much time, this is number 5, how much time passed between the time Noah did what the Lord had commanded him and the end of the flood. There were 47 days. Remember, God gave Noah the command, and Noah had 7 days to build the ark, and then the flood was for 40 days. So between the time that God instructed Noah and the flood was over, it was 47 days. Number 6, compare chapter 6 verse 22 to chapter 7 verse 5. And what I realized is 2 times God said, and Noah did everything the Lord had commanded him. Just he said in chapter 6, and he said it again in chapter 7, emphasizing obedience to God. Number 7, who entered the boat with Noah to escape the flood? Verses 7 and 8 tell us that Noah's wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 sons' wives. So altogether, it would have been 8 of them, right? The 3 sons and their wives, 6, and then Noah and his wife, 2 additional, 8 of them. But remember, God said Noah was righteous. I'm not saying these other people weren't righteous, but God identified Noah as being righteous, which said to me that his family was blessed because of his righteousness. And I believe the same is for us. Our families, our communities are impacted by how we walk with God, even if everyone else isn't. Sometimes God will show favor and influence in our spheres of influence based on how we live our lives with God. Number 8, how much time passed between the time they got on the boat and when it actually began raining and flooding? According to verse 10, and the next question is, what else happened in Genesis in this same amount of time that we have already talked about? The answer, according to verse 10, is it took 7 days. And what we also know is that God created the earth and rested in 7 days. And what this shows to me is, in my opinion, it was like a rebirth was taking place. I say a rebirth was taking place because God's original birthing of the world took place in 7 days, including the day God rested. And now here we are, God rebirthing, and it took 7 days. And so maybe there's something special about the number 7, that there's this process of rebirthing and new beginnings and creation that God uses this number 7 to produce. Number 9, after Noah, his family, and the animals entered the ark or the boat, what did the Lord do? And it's a God closed the door behind them. Number 10, in verse 17 to 18, something significant happened. Tell me what you think it is. This stood out to me. Eventually, the boat floated safely on the surface, which suggested to me that there was a point in which it didn't, yet Noah and his family was still in the center of God's will. What am I saying? Noah and his family and these animals are on this ark in the middle of this flood. And of course, the ark is probably going to and fro, and it's going through all of this distress and this turmoil. But this distress and this turmoil, it's still Noah being in the center of God's will. And sometimes we don't realize that even some of the distress and the toil that's happening in our lives can still be us being in the center of God's will, because what God is ultimately going to produce requires this process. And eventually, yes, the boat will get to a point where it is safe and it is still, but it still has to go through that process. And I think one thing to learn from this is to not despise the process that we're going through. Even though there's a beautiful end result, it requires a process. Number 11, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But how long did the floodwaters cover the earth after the rain ceased? 150 days. I bring this up because a lot of times when the story of Noah is preached in church, they just talk about the 40 days and the 40 nights of the rain. But they don't talk about, even after it stopped flooding, it still took 150 days for the impact of the flood to cease. For the flood waters to recede, to get back to a level where Noah and them can even get out the boat. So I said, how long did the flood waters cover the earth? 150 days. The effect of the 40 days was 150 days. Number 12, and the question I ask us every week is, what stood out to us in this chapter? What stood out to this passage? What are you learning? And I put a point that I want to make is the reality of starting over. I was reading in my Bible about Noah, right? And a lot of Bibles these days will also have footnotes or points that people, the editors of the Bible want to point out. And I want to read this. It says, Noah walked in close fellowship with God. I want to read this point. It says, we've all seen flooding. If not firsthand, we've seen it on video clips. Spring floods of the Mississippi River, hurricanes on southern coastlines, and tsunamis in Japan. We've also seen post-flood devastation, bloated bodies, mucky debris, broken trees, and colorless vegetation. There's nothing pretty after the flood. Starting over is difficult, but God's presence and his promises strengthen Noah to persevere. He will strengthen us too during difficult times. And my encouragement for this week is, even when starting over with God, it can be a difficult process. When God takes us to new places, new territories, it can be new jobs, it could be starting a family, it could just be starting over a new career, a new business venture. There are different areas of our lives where sometimes we find ourselves starting over. And it could be a very difficult, strenuous process. But the encouragement is, just as the presence of God was with Moses as he had to literally start over humanity, the presence of God is with you and I too. So be encouraged. That's chapter 7 of this week. I look forward to jumping into chapter 8 with you guys as we walk through the Bible, we walk it out, and we journey through the Bible together.